Good day, denizens. Let's talk some Africa and the trading states of Africa. This actually runs from the 700s BCE up into really about the 13 or 1400s CE, even though it says 1500s. We actually only go 13 or 1400s. Sorry to let you down with that. But with Africa, we kind of sprinkle it in here to try to fit it within the context of all the other things that we've been discussing thus far. So bear with me. So some of the things we'll look at, obviously geography has a major effect on the development of the entire continent of Africa. You know, I never even understood that song, The Rains Down in Africa. Like, all of it? Africa is a massive, massive continent. So the rains, I guess they went all over Africa to feel said rains? I don't know. But regardless, it is kind of unfortunate because we tend to treat Africa as one large country. It's almost like the people trying to get the countries right on the Jimmy Kimmel show. But nonetheless, sadly, we sort of do that in a sense here just to get us kind of caught up. But obviously, Africa and the alterations in especially sub-Saharan Africa are going to have a major impact on the development of culture, not only in Africa, but also affects really across Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia, and eventually even into the Americas. We're going to look at some major kingdoms like Nubia and ancient Egypt to an extent, but also places like Axum and Ethiopia. We're going to look at outside influences coming in, especially to northern Africa, the development of Islam spreading into the place. Some of the major trading routes, especially along the Sahara, where salt and gold held equal, if salt didn't even hold even more value in early Africa. We're going to look at some of the rulers of some major kingdoms. We're especially, though, going to look at Christianity in Axum and how Ethiopia holds out from falling to Islam and maintains, even to this day, its own version of Christianity called Coptic Christianity. We're going to look at some trade, and we're going to talk some culture. Some of the terms that we'll see here are a lot of environmental terms, and tomorrow we will be rolling the bones, Vamadahana ritual. We'll talk about that down in Madagascar on the morrow, and some other terms here for you as well. Okay, so during the so-called second wave era, remember the second wave is basically the 300 or 400 years just before the year zero, when we see some of these new civilizations, or rather new empires, form. African civilizations are experiencing many of the same things that we saw in Eurasia. And we start to see some really major empires develop around Nubia. The Egyptians are still holding on, and also down in Axum. And two, another major component of this time are the so-called Bantu migrations, which you see on the map here in the blue. But before we get to that, let's just talk a little geography here. Obviously, you look to the north, you see the vast Sahara Desert in Africa, which actually used to be more of a rainforest. It's true. Then you see the grasslands of the savanna as we keep going south. As we get down onto the equator, we see the beautiful rainforests of, the map says Zaire. It's actually the Congo. And the Congo, just to give you an idea of how big Africa is. The Congo would fit Belgium, Italy, England, and France, and others as well. That's how big, another 1 or 2 European countries, that's how big the Congo is. So you can only imagine how big Africa is. So I hate to return to it, but if you're feeling the rains down in Africa, it's a lot. It's a lot. And then the drier woodlands as you get down to the south. Okay, so the Sahara, like I said a second ago, just over 7,000 years ago, was watered. It had water, it had forests, it had rivers. But major climate change as we roll into the 3000s, 2500 BCE leads to desertification. In other words, land becoming desert. And you can only imagine, over the course of, hundreds of years, thousands of years, how this is going to greatly alter how people live there and interact there. So basically, people who were there, well, you got to move because even back then, you still had to eat. So you had, a lot of people with Bantu, which is basically a huge umbrella of languages with one, with common sets of sounds. People begin to migrate, from essentially northern Africa, what is today the Sahara, and migrate south. And this really begins around the 1000s BCE and continues well into the CE era, perhaps as late as 1000 CE. But what happens is with all of these peoples migrating south, we start to see major diversity, numerous cultures, and some great empires, like Greater Zimbabwe, for example, that are going to be constructed as these peoples move south. And just to give you an idea here, collectively there's probably about 400 different Bantu languages, so there's quite a few there. And the thing about the Bantu migration, it wasn't one of conquest. This wasn't people trying to go out and conquer an empire. As a matter of fact, it was probably more of just a natural organic movement. It's not people saying, hey, let's go conquer to the south. No, it's people trying to escape weather changes just so that they can survive with their families. So it's this slow movement over the course really of, in the end, thousands of years. And basically their own lifestyles and technologies come along with them. Now this is entirely over land. There is no water movement of the Bantu migration. It's all over land. But with this, these peoples, these Bantu peoples bring into the regions you see in the map in the gold, they bring in, their ironworking techniques, their technologies, making pottery, their methods for taking care of animals and animal husbandry, languages, crops. So this definitely spreads, language and culture and ingenuity into southern Africa. So basically, Africa south of the equator there really becomes its own distinctive region, distinctive as in very much different from northern Africa, which will come under the sway of Islam. So just delving back in time a tad here, the ancient Nile kingdom of Nubia, going all the way back to even the 700s BCE, Nubia and Egypt had this interesting relationship. Ancient Egypt for the longest time dominated, up and down the Nile River until we roll into roughly the 700s when Nubia actually rises, and they're actually able to conquer much of Egypt. But these two empires, these two civilizations also share culture and technologies and things like this. And basically, like it says here, the pharaohs sometimes conquered Nubia, but then the Nubians would conquer the Egyptians and so on. But eventually, the Nubian king conquers Egypt by the 700s BCE, and Nubia is going to control Egypt for about a century. The thing is they actually had some respect for Egyptian culture and architecture. So luckily they didn't destroy it, in a similar way that I guess you could say the Romans had a respect for the Greeks to an extent. Sorry about that, I had a small interruption here. But nonetheless, so what the Nubians do is they move their capital to a place called Meroe, where they have these amazing blast furnaces where they develop copious amounts of iron. So they also became, very good at ironworking. Now, of course, this is, 700 years, 600 or 700 years after the Hittites up in Turkey. But regardless, they created this stuff in isolation. So, they're creating their own ironworks and their own amazing tools all on their own as well. And two, Meroe is over, near the Red Sea. So they have Red Sea access for trade routes and everything else. So we see gold and ivory, animal skins, all these things moving from the Nubians. And it could be, we still don't know to this day, the name is still actually debated, but the term Nubia itself could actually come from the Nubian term Nub, which means gold. And other historians have other explanations for the name of the place. But regardless, Nubia becomes very wealthy and pretty good at making iron. Now, the Nubians did worship their own gods. They didn't, worship the Egyptian gods. As a matter of fact, they even had their own lion-headed warrior god, Apademak. I don't know. They actually created their own system of writing. They had their own alphabet. They didn't adopt Egyptian hieroglyphics. They didn't need to. And just like with the Harappans, who are thousands of years even before this, we also don't know Nubia's ancient alphabet. We have not deciphered it. So I'll let you guys get on that. By the 300s, we're going to see Aksum rise, and Aksum, which will really be the foundation of Ethiopia, will eventually overwhelm Nubia and take it over, and sadly destroy quite a bit of its architecture, buildings, monuments, and so on. And we'll do that there at the bottom later. Now, in Northern Africa becomes greatly influenced by the Roman Empire. Basically, the Roman Empire, by the 100s 100 BCE into 0 into 100 CE. Once the Romans have conquered Northern Africa and made the Mediterranean their lake, the thing about the Romans is they also build lots and lots of roads and dams and cities and aqueducts. So because of this allows for more migrations into Northern Africa. So basically then what's going to happen, and of course you also need those ferocious animals for the gladiators, but nonetheless, what they're able to do is allow for civilizations to spread. And in this case, as we roll into the 100s, 200s, 300s, one of the most important things to spread into Northern Africa will be Christianity. And Christianity is going to really take off in Northern Africa. And obviously, Roman soldiers they're going to get more soldiers out of Africa as well. But as Christianity spreads, it becomes this great unifying force, and there's a lot of literature and great historical Christian writings that will come out of this area, especially St. Augustine, who is one of the most influential Christian thinkers of all time in the Roman era, but he's operating out of present-day Algeria. He served as the bishop of Hippo, which was this ancient city in what was Carthage. Carthage was also taken over by the Romans during the Punic Wars way back when. But nonetheless, Christianity is able to really gain some roots in Northern Africa. Problem is, once the Roman Empire falls apart, it's going to be very difficult for Christianity to hold on in Northern Africa because of the lack of the government systems of the Roman Empire. Not only that, but we see a lot of trade, especially with the camels. Just like we talked about with the Silk Road, camels play a huge role as well with the Saharan trade network. We'll see a map of that here in a sec. But by 200 CE, the Common Era, we have these camels that come in out of Asia, and they get the nickname the ships of the desert. I mean, camels were simply amazing. I mean, they could traverse the Saharan trade network. They could carry 500 pounds. They could go 20 to 30 miles without water. I mean, that's a pretty amazing animal. And by the time we roll into the 600 CE, remember the Romans, that empire, the Western Empire that is, has been gone by the 600s for over 100 years. So that leaves Northern Africa ripe for Islam to come in and take over. And remember, people began to flock toward Islam in Northern Africa because Islam brought two things: a religious faith and also stability. Because remember, the Quran lays out not only the religious faith, but also the political system. To Muslims, religion and law are one and the same. And we see, the Muslims begin to fight against what we call Berbers. Berbers are just nomads. They're the nomadic people of the northern plains and northern deserts, that is, of Northern Africa. But eventually, Islam is going to bring them into the realm of the faith, and they'll go north and conquer even into Spain. And indeed, Islam ends up replacing Christianity in Northern Africa, and the impact of this, is still very much felt today, as we'll talk about more and more as the year goes on, especially in the second half. And Latin is replaced. There's no more Latin speaking in Northern Africa. It'll be replaced with Arabic, which still sticks around today. There they are in all their glory, the camels. I think those might be super camels. So Islam in Africa, Islamic civilization just absolutely took off, and some major cities developed like Cairo and Fez, where they build some major mosques. But the most important one that's going to develop is Timbuktu. We'll talk about it here in a second. But Islam is going to bring Northern Africa into a global trade network, and Islam is going to be carried, all the way into Western Africa. So, really, it's Islam coming into Northern Africa that is going to bring Northern Africa into what we would really call today Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia, Africa into Europe, into Asia, connecting all of these places. And some of the kingdoms that develop, Timbuktu is the most amazing in Mali, this city. And we hear from Leo Africanus, who was this great traveler. Leo Africanus was his European name. He would have called himself Hassan ibn Muhammad. Muhammad, typically that's a name that Muslims take on in honor of Muhammad. Ibn actually is not a name. That means son of. So he is the son of Muhammad, not the Muhammad, but his father was named Muhammad, so this guy's name is Hassan. Anyway, here's what he said about this great Timbuktu, this amazing city. He says, look, there are many shops here, merchants. There are, linens being weaved, cotton cloth. We have all kinds of merchants, the Barbary merchants, referring to people on the Barbary coast, Northern Africa, who bring cloth of Europe. Women in this region, except for maidservants, go with their faces covered and sell all the necessary foods. So with their faces covered, obviously you can see what hold Islam has also taken in the area. Timbuktu is just this amazing trade network. It is the heart and soul of it. Connecting, from Cairo and northern Egypt, up into the Mediterranean and into Italy and Europe. And really, from about 800 CE to 1600 CE, we see these amazing kingdoms develop in Western Africa, Ghana, Mali, Songhai. These kingdoms, on and off will control this trade network, which is going to make some very, 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 very wealthy empires and emperors. And here you see Sankore University at Timbuktu. You can see in this structure here, the water slide actually ran down from the top inside of here. That's just a joke. There's no water slide. But this university here is pretty remarkable, and you can see on the map where it's located in Africa, and then more specifically in Mali. But the big thing about Timbuktu is this: it's not only huge for the exchange of goods, linens and cloths and gold and salt. It also becomes a major exchange of education. Many madrasas are built in this area. Madrasa is an Islamic school where essentially you memorize the Quran word for word. Doesn't sound like an easy thing to do, but nonetheless, people from all over Afro-Eurasia traveled to Timbuktu just for schooling, just for education, let alone for the trade. And gold and salt, you can see the Saharan trade network here, similar but different at the same time from the Silk Road, where gold and salt become the most important things. Now, salt is necessary for your body to retain water. Now, of course, if you take in a lot of salt, you get thirsty, but that also helps hold the water within you. You have no salt, you no live. So salt becomes very, very important. And of course, gold, ooh, shiny, me want gold. Problem is, can't really eat gold. Though people have actually tried, because people in Europe in ancient times, well, not even ancient, in like the 1300s, used to think if you ground up gold and drank it with water, that would give you longer life. Turns out that's not true. But nonetheless, we see major trade networks, connecting the Sahara to the Mediterranean, all the way across into the Middle East as we roll into the CE era. And there you can see some of the stuff that's being traded and exchanged thanks to the camel. AP folk, we'll talk about this one tomorrow. Shrinking of Lake Chad, which is very important for theme 1. If you're not in AP, then we need to keep going. So yeah, gold and salt, very, very critical. And there's actually tons of gold, or there was tons of gold in Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal. Thing is, gold, it says gold was plentiful. Well, that's a relative term. For example, to this day, all the gold in the world, if we could collect it all in one place, it would fill about 2.5 to 3 Olympic-sized pools. And that's all the gold that we have. By going back to the year 1890s, 1900 to that era, there was enough gold on the planet to fill a two-story house, right? So gold is very, very rare. Thing is that many scientists today, and I guess it'd be geologists, think that actually there's tons and tons and tons of gold in the earth. The problem is that during the Great Bombardment, as scientists call it, billions of years ago, gold, which came out from stars and landed on meteorites over the course of billions of years, millions of years, it put the gold closer to the Earth's core, and we can't quite get there. So it could be that we have lots and lots of gold, we just can't get to it. Neither here nor there. So, in these areas, you have the men, digging for the gold, the women, of course, washing the soil off of it to get the gold dust, and then, you have merchants trying to, trade gold, but it's also very dangerous. You don't want to let people know that you have gold because, well, they'll rob you on the trade network. So they would actually carry things like feather quills, like a feather pen, but it would be hollowed out inside, and actually they would hide gold in there. But I guess if we know about it, that means that the thieves figured that out too. So I don't know how long that lasted. Nonetheless, very important commodities then come into West Africa, like salt. You have to have salt to ironically prevent dehydration. And then, of course, it also tastes good, but you don't want to eat too much of that either. And eventually, with all this trade, we're going to see some major cities emerge and some very, very strong and rich kings. And Mali is one of these. Mali is an Arab term meaning where the king dwells, which comes from Mandinka. But the Mansas, or the kings themselves, basically come to take over these large territories in what is today Mali and create all these great gold mining regions. And the most important, transitory point, pivot point was Timbuktu. And this is where the caravans is simply a group of travelers. They might be on camels or whatever. And they, travel through Timbuktu. And the greatest of all of these emperors of Mali is a guy named Mansa Musa. And Mansa Musa is probably the richest man in terms of material wealth to ever be on planet Earth. But nonetheless, he expands Mali, to the Atlantic and north. And, he maintains peace and order. He also converts to Islam. And a guy named Ibn Battuta, who we will talk about in much more detail, when he visited Mansa Musa and Mansa Musa's kingdom, he said, hey, the traveler here has no reason to fear thieves than the man who stays home. In other words, this is a very secure empire developed and maintained by this dude here on the right. That's actually in a European book. This is how the Europeans understood Mansa Musa and how they viewed him. And like I said, he converted to Islam and based his government on Sharia, or the law, which is the law held within the Quran. Thing is, he didn't adopt all the Muslim customs, right? Women didn't have to wear veils. Women were not secluded to the home. So Mansa Musa was not nearly as restrictive in his version of Islam as, say, Muslims in Saudi Arabia back then, or really the Middle East. And he actually went on the Hajj, the great pilgrimage to Mecca. And I chuckle a little bit because Mansa Musa is still not highly liked today, believe it or not, in Mali, because when he goes on this Hajj, he decides to take pretty much all of his gold. And he had more gold than any other human being on the planet. Well, he took it and he handed out almost all of it, bankrupting his empire essentially. But hey, that's one of the 5 pillars. You're supposed to give to charity. But I guess they're not so charitable today, because basically Mali, which is very poverty stricken today, you don't want to roll up into Mali and start talking about Mansa Musa. They're a little sore about that. 700 years later. Nonetheless, this guy forges all kinds of diplomatic and economic ties with other Islamic states, and by the 1400s CE, so we're talking, Columbus's era, right? Timbuktu is one of the wealthiest cities on the planet. It's one of the most learned cities for people gaining educational information on the planet. And Mansa Musa builds all kinds of madrasas, or these religious schools. And you can see, for example, one of the mosques up here that he built. And you can see here too the Mali Empire and its extent. Well, another kingdom that develops is over on the other side of Africa by the Red Sea, called Axum. And the people from Axum are quite a bit different. They actually bring really Judaism, ironically, into Axum over in northeastern Africa. So Axum becomes this very unique place where basically they'll adopt Judaism and eventually convert over to Christianity, while the rest of northern Africa falls to Islam. They even create their own unique written language that says Ge'ez. And Axum ends up controlling this great trade route, along the Red Sea. So you can imagine why, they're so wealthy and prosperous and successful if you can control all that trade that you see there on the Red Sea. And Axum becomes a major market as well. Now notice too the years here. We've gone back in time again. Go figure in a world history class. We're back to 200 and 400, 400 to 200 BCE here. But we'll catch back up to where we were here in a second. Okay, so it'd be more than a second. But nonetheless, Axum today, is just a modern city in Ethiopia, because Axum really is going to be the foundation of the country of Ethiopia. And the term Ethiopia was actually roughly called that by the Greeks, which means land of burnt faces. Aethiops in Greek means I burn, and opsis means roughly appearance. So I have a burned appearance. And that's what the Greeks said of these peoples in this area, that they would have called Ethiopia. Ethiopia. There you go. And here you see an interesting church in modern day Axum in Ethiopia. That ain't a mosque. Islam does not get into Ethiopia. They hold tight to Christianity. So, talking about Axum here for a second, Axum also becomes this great trade nexus. We're going to see them getting ivory and gold and things like this, and trading that with merchants who are coming across the Arabian Sea, even out of India, all the way into the Red Sea to trade with Axum, and then that stuff finding its way north into the Mediterranean, eventually into Europe. So basically, you have this very cosmopolitan city, where numerous people are coming together: Greek, Egyptian, Arab, Jewish, African, Indian, all these different peoples trading all of these goods, iron and spices and precious metals and things like that. But what about Christianity? It's kind of cool what happens with Ethiopia. Because of its geography, Ethiopia is able to really maintain its own independence, well into the 19th century. Even the Europeans, when they conquer almost all of Africa, by the end of the 19th century, there are only two places that will remain independent in all of Africa: Liberia and, you guessed it, Ethiopia. And this actually stretches back to one of Axum's great kings, Ezana, who converted to Christianity in the 300s. So right about the time that we see the Roman Empire converting, we also see Ethiopia. And we start to see the construction of Christian churches. And by the 600s, of course, Islam has come into Africa. Rome has fallen, but Ethiopia holds out. However, Ethiopia has its own very special version of Christianity. Axum, of course, is going to decline, as all empires do, as more and more people come in, but they also adopt the Christianity that's coming in. As a matter of fact, Ethiopians remained independent for centuries, practicing Coptic Christianity, or the Coptic Christian faith. What's that you say? Well, Coptic Christianity, so here it is. Egyptian priests began to translate the Bible into what we call Coptic Egyptian. The Egyptians, over the course of time, moved on from hieroglyphics and created their own alphabet, Coptic alphabet, but then, of course, also translated the Bible. So by the 400 CE, you have numerous monasteries and other places, like even caves, where religious Christian religious leaders would meet. And these monks, these reclusive monks, dedicated themselves to, spirituality and spreading the gospel. But over time, language, theology, practice of Egyptian Christianity, it diverged away from the old Roman version or even Constantinople version, which would be Eastern Orthodoxy, basically giving Ethiopia its own version of Christianity. And, so basically, even though Axum, the government itself falls, its culture and its religion remained. And because Ethiopia was protected, still is, by these great rugged mountains, it was able to remain independent and remained unified by Coptic Christian faith. And some of these people made pilgrimages to Jerusalem. They introduced, new types of religious worship using like drums and music and dance into church services. And Ethiopian kings actually claimed that they descended from the Israelite king Solomon. And the Queen of Sheba. And they actually collected this story in an ancient book called The Glory of Kings. And here you see, for example, the most sacred church in Ethiopia. Okay, so it looks a little barren. So what? Pretty cool place. In this church, the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, indeed, they claim to have, the Ark of the Covenant in this church. Now, of course, they're not exactly showing it to us, but they do claim to have it. And here you can see also another really, really cool church that is a Christian church in Ethiopia. This is the Church of St. George. If you look here, it's actually down in this large hole in the ground. And here you see the top picture shows from above. From above, there's actually a cross on the roof. And then you go down here, and on the inside, you can walk around. You can see some of the caves and things like that, where apparently there must be stairs on the outside where people can come in above ground and meander their way down to get into the church. And that's actually carved out of a single block of stone. That's pretty serious. So that concludes our little talk here on Africa. A quick history there, running over, just a couple thousand years, no big deal. But there's some extra info here if you're interested. If you're AP, go ahead and look through the extra info. But nonetheless, that wraps this one up, y'all. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for listening in. And we'll see you on the flip side.